Welcome to Lunchtime Babbling. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, bias, disparate impact, and good governance. So this is another one in a series of conversations that we're going to have. Again, we're going to focus on the New York City Local Law 144, although the things I'm going to talk about today, which are bias audits in particular, are going to apply to lots of other regulations and also just good practice within data science organizations. So what I'll do now is share my screen. So this is again number 2 in this series. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. I'm not gonna check it till the end, but I'm gonna try to make this fairly quick, around half an hour, and then I'll take a look at questions at the end. So what I'm going to talk about today are basically bias audits, and so I'm going to talk first about the basics of bias audits. What are they? I think why we would do them is pretty obvious, but I'll talk about what they are. And then today I'd like to focus a little bit on the differences between employers versus vendors. And employers are the ones who are using the algorithms themselves. The vendors are the ones that are creating them. Sometimes those two are the same thing. And it doesn't have to be employers. This could apply to any company that's using an automated decision tool that does anything that's consequential for humans. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. All right, so let me first talk about the bias audit basics. And I think most of you probably know quite a bit about this, but essentially a bias audit tests an algorithm for differences in performance based on membership in a protected category. Now, it doesn't have to be a protected category. In fact, strictly speaking, it could be just differential performance based on any sort of characteristic. And so race, gender, disability status, age, those sorts of things are protected categories. And importantly, we're also interested in whether this can lead to disparate impact on members of these groups. And I should emphasize, this is really only a small part of a larger audit framework and governance framework. And we're just focusing on testing sort of the narrow input-output function that I'm just going to call an algorithm. Okay, it could be machine learning based, it could be AI based. We don't really care. There's going to be some inputs, there will be some outputs, and those outputs can be biased based on what category you belong to as a person and the intersections thereof. And so there's some more some references here. Ada Lovelace Institute has a very good white paper on this, and this is our paper, the algorithm audit that the BABL team put out, and so you can take a look at those for more information there. So let me talk real broadly here. The algorithm is presumably an algorithm that's going to be working on people's data. So on the left-hand side, for those who are just listening to this, there's a graphic on the screen where on the left-hand side there are people, and labeled with different colors because people are all different. And so these people, their data has to get into the algorithm in some way. So I have a line that says filter, and that filter can be any number of things. It's some way of extracting data about people or from people to feed into the algorithm, because clearly it has to be in a form that the algorithm can take. And so that gets fed into the inputs, and there are all sorts of selection effects that happen through this filter. And a lot of the bias happens, in fact, in this very first process. But for now, let's just assume that the data somehow gets into the form that an algorithm could take. And then there we have this black box, which is the algorithm. It doesn't have to be a black box. Some algorithms, especially if you're a vendor, you know a lot about the algorithm and how it works. But from our perspective, let's just assume that there's something mysterious is happening inside this algorithm. And then we get outputs based on that. So this is a simple cartoon form of what we're talking about. but it really is, there's a lot of complexities, even in a simple cartoon picture of what these systems might look like. So an important thing that we always emphasize is you have to really understand the context of the system in order to do a bias audit. And so you have to understand your own biases. You have to understand how people interact with these systems. But I won't go into that right now because I've talked at length about that in other places, and I probably will talk at length in the future about that. But right now, let's just focus on the actual testing. So with a clear-eyed view of your assumptions and biases, the basic idea here is that you're going to classify the inputs based on group. So that all of the protected categories that I talked about before, as many as you have access to, and you can somehow label the inputs based on that. What you'd like to do is you'd like to put that data through the algorithm, and you look for systematic differences in the output. That's kind of that's the whole idea. That's the basic idea. Bias is sort of a shift in what the algorithm should get versus what it actually gets. And so that's the sort of the basic definition of a bias, the offset between what it should get and what it actually gets. And importantly, the societal bias that we're looking for is where that offset is depends on what class you're in. And so that's the main idea here. Now, a lot of people are worried about disparate impact, which is something slightly different. So disparate impact, and this is relevant for the New York City law, which I'll talk about in a second. Disparate impact essentially focuses on selection rates, and it's mostly used in the employment context, where the selection rate for any race, sex, or ethnic group, which is less than 4/5 or 80% of the rate of the group with the highest selection rate, that is evidence of disparate impact. So you're impacting one group more than another group. Now, there's a lot of nuances here to whether you actually have disparate impact or not. So, for instance, smaller differences in selection rates may constitute adverse impact or disparate impact. Those are used sort of interchangeably. Where the differences are significant, both statistically and in practical terms. And so, statistical significant difference means that you can tell the difference statistically between the outputs of the selection rate for one group versus another group. And so if you add more data, then essentially the uncertainty goes down and you can start seeing statistically significant differences. Now, the practical differences or practical significance depends on whether that effect matters at all, whether it's going to have any real effect on the groups. And so those two things are different, and you can test for them in different ways. And then, of course, if the user of the tool has actions that discourage applicants disproportionately based on some of these protected categories, that would also count. Greater differences. So let's say you have greater than 4/5. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's adverse impact as well, because if you have really small numbers, and this is something that I think a lot of comments on the New York City law pointed out, that it matters if you have small numbers, because you could have statistically insignificant results because you just don't have enough information to tell whether the impact ratio you got was in fact something that was real or just a statistical fluke. And then, of course, if you have some sort of special recruiting programs or like affirmative action, that could cause these differences as well, but they're intentional. And importantly, bias and disparate impact are not the same thing. So what's called in most of the forthcoming regulations, and including New York City law, most people are concerned about testing for bias. And bias does not necessarily give rise to disparate impact. And it's not put in the context necessarily of selection rates at all. Bias can include differential performance in any metric that you might choose based on class. And so it's important to understand that bias is broader than disparate impact. There's more that you can do there. So that's the basic idea. I just wanted to give you sort of an overview. So you are going to try to test this algorithm. It has inputs, it gives you outputs, and so you need to classify the inputs based on these protected categories. Ideally, these are self-reported categories, so you have a pretty good confidence that you know that people belong to these groups. And then you look at the outputs and you look for statistical significant differences between the categories. But what about the New York City law and how this relates to vendors versus employers? So here's a review of what the law actually says. So they say that a bias audit is an impartial evaluation by an independent auditor. Such bias audit shall include but not be limited to. So this is really saying that bias is not disparate impact. So it should include but not be limited to assessing the tool's disparate impact on persons of any component one category. So that just means gender and race ethnicity, pursuant to the code federal regulations. So, follow the EEOC regulations essentially. So an important bit that in this law that I've talked about before, and most of you know, is that this is for employers and employment agencies that are using the tool. So the requirements of this law is that you have to do a bias audit. And when I say you have to do it, you have to have it done, because it has to be an independent and impartial evaluation. And employers and employment agencies are the ones that have to do it. Okay, so they're the ones using the tool, and they are the ones responsible for having this bias audit done. So what's the general workflow here? In some sense, for employers doing this, the workflow is fairly straightforward. So essentially, or presumably, you have maybe more than one of these AEDTs, so automated employment decision tools, in your pipeline. So you are getting candidates, maybe you have employees, and you're using an AEDT to make promotion decisions, which is also covered under the law. And so you need to identify and isolate where are you using a particular AEDT. So if you have more than one, you're going to have to do this for each of them. So identify exactly where and how you're using this tool to make hiring and promotion decisions. So you look at your funnel, you say, okay, this is the place where people are coming into this tool, and then where it's selecting people out of this tool. Now, there are some nuances here. It may be not an automatic filter. It may be a hiring manager or someone else in your organization is using the outputs of this tool to make some decision. And in the last webinar, I talked about this idea of modifying a human decision, which is one thing that would make a tool an AEDT. You have to have a discussion about how much effect does this have on your decisions that you're making. But let's say it does have a significant effect. You've isolated where you're using it. The second step is to start collecting relevant data. So not every employer might be collecting, let's say, information specific to each individual AEDT. Typically, you might have people applying for jobs, and then at the end, you eventually hire people. You're collecting data on either end. Now, for this law, you need to start thinking about individual AEDT relevant data. So people have entered the AEDT, the tool's been used, and then some are selected and some are not. And so capturing that data is the important thing. And so hopefully there is sufficient demographic information that people have self-reported that allow you to collect enough data to do these assessments. And part 3, or step 3, is then actually calculating the impact ratios. So once you've isolated that data, you need to use the data to effectively get selection rates. So over some period of time, and please document over which period of time you've done this. Over some period of time, let's say the last 3 months or something, or the last year, however long you've been using the AEDT, you are going to see how many people applied, break them out into groups, and how many people got through. And you're going to calculate selection rates based on that, percentages. And then impact ratios are simply the ratio of the selection rate divided by the highest selection rate of the advantaged group. So whoever had the highest selection rate, you're going to divide by that. And that's the impact ratio. And so this is an example of this that was actually given by the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. And I showed this on the last webinar. These are the numbers, examples that they gave. So here it's broken out on an intersectional basis. It remains to be seen whether that's something that is going to be required or they just did this as an example. But you can see that we have race and gender both taken together. And you have a number of applicants. You have the number selected by the AEDT. You can calculate the selection rate based on that. And then you can calculate the impact ratio. This is what needs to be shown in the public summary. These numbers, they made it very clear in the new proposed rules, which presumably will get accepted, that this has to be shown publicly. So part of the public output of the bias audit is indeed these numbers. And so it's important to understand where these numbers came from and to document exactly where you got all of these numbers over what time period, and whether there was any sort of modification of those numbers for some reason. And this is what you show. So for an employer, this is fairly straightforward in theory, if you can capture that information in a fairly straightforward way, meaning who applied through a particular AEDT, who got through that AEDT, calculating those two, the number of applicants and the number selected, you can get selection rate and impact ratios are fairly straightforward, assuming you have demographic information for at least some subset. Problems, of course, are going to arise when you have small numbers. And so you could get evidence for disparate impact, which may not be statistically significant. And so these are all things that you have to think about. So what about vendors? So vendors are not strictly required by the law to do this. However, practically, a lot of vendors are getting either pressure or asked by employers to provide some information for these bias audits, and either provide the bias audits themselves or to give the employers enough information that they can present bias audit results. So this was sort of shored up by the fact that in the new rules, one of the examples they gave, an employer wants an AEDT. I'm quoting now from the new rules. An employer wants to use an AEDT to screen resumes and schedule interviews for a job posting. To do so, the employer asks the vendor for a bias audit. Okay, so here the example is explicitly talking about an employer asking a vendor for a bias audit. And presumably because the vendor can't do it themselves, they have gotten some independent group to verify this. The vendor uses historical data. It's collected from employers. And so I talked about this last week. The plural here for employers is implying that even if there's not a lot of data, let's say for an individual employer, that there might be scope for vendors to gather data from multiple employers, if it's appropriate, in order to test for potential disparate impact. And so this is the example that was given. So vendors, in fact, it seems it is appropriate in some cases for vendors to do this for their employers. So unfortunately for vendors, the workflow here is going to be a little bit different because most vendors, I think, not all, but most vendors, I think, don't have access, and for good reason, to the demographic information from people who are going through their system. If you're familiar with the GDPR context, they're processors rather than controllers. They're not really controlling the data. They're simply processing the data on their system. And so this makes it a little bit more difficult. So if they have demographic information, the workflow may look very similar to what the employers have, because they simply need to say who used our tool, how many people made it through, what group do they belong to, what are the selection rates, and it's done. It gets complicated if you don't have that, and it gets further complicated if your tool, and this is true for employers in fact as well, if your tool isn't necessarily used to filter per se, So selection rate may not be the most appropriate metric to use. And so vendors now have to sort of struggle through exactly what are they going to measure, how are they going to measure it, and how are they going to justify that. So the workflow here says more risk, more work, and I think that is true. There is more risk here because the results may not be broadly applicable. So our recommendation is the first thing you need to do is assemble a team. So you got to have a multidisciplinary team, probably include legal, technical, maybe ethical specialties and product specialists. So assemble a team, and we would like you to perform a risk assessment. We think we've done a number of these sorts of assessments, bias testing, and we never do it without a ethical risk assessment because it's really hard to understand what you need to measure if you don't understand the risks. And so we think that everybody should be doing this, even if it's just a minimal risk assessment. So a risk assessment, and we have documentation if you want to see like kind of how to do this, but you need to identify and prioritize the key risks of using this tool. So hopefully dig into sort of potential root causes of bias. So get together, really talk about what happens when this tool goes wrong potentially, or if someone could use it or misinterpret it in some way. What are the risks associated to candidates or employees that this tool might be used on? And once you have that, you can move on to step 3, which is to define metrics. So you need to choose an appropriate metric that corresponds to adverse outcome for your AEDT. So one easy example is a ranking algorithm. So let's say and I think a lot of these AEDTs do assign some score. It could be based on some capability or goodness of fit for the job. And so you might rank candidates. And so you need to decide what is an adverse outcome for someone who gets ranked on that list. And the department does open the door for the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, and the new rules is opening the door for using the score itself to calculate disparate impact. I would personally avoid that. I would actually think through what above what score are you getting advantaged and below what score are you getting disadvantaged. So if you show up on page 2, then nobody's going to ever look at it. That's an example of a judgment call that you might make after a risk assessment. Or maybe if you're not in the top 5, that could be a problem. Or there might be a literal number cutoff. 75 and above is a good outcome and 74 and below is bad. That's what the risk assessment is for. And so come up with some metric that you're going to measure. And step 4, you need to collect the testing data. So again, if you have demographic information for candidates who are flowing through your system, maybe you own the platform. Maybe it's a platform where people log on to your platform and it's for sourcing to employers. You might have gathered that information from them, or there might be some exit survey. So if you have that information, collecting the testing data should be fairly straightforward. You can categorize people based on these groups. Some of the questions that you're going to have to ask is how much data and from where do I gather it, such as it's appropriate for this law. So if you just take data from people from New York City, it may be very limited. Is it okay to take data from places other than New York? I'm going to give you my opinion. I think the opinion is probably yes, if you're able to get sufficient numbers by doing that, and you think that the population is not significantly different. But those are things you have to think through. And so collecting that testing data is step 4. If you don't have demographic information, this is where things get difficult. And I think having a conversation with your employers or your clients that are using your tool to see if you can get that data, that would be one way of approaching this. Another way of approaching it would be if you have training and testing data that you used for the algorithm in the first place, is there a way of getting demographic information from that data or labeling it in some way? And so all of those things are options that you need to think through, think carefully what the implications of them are. And then once you have that data, step 5 is to measure the disparate impact. So you need to take your whatever your metric was, and then construct impact ratios for each category separately. And finally, I think number 6, documenting the assessment. This is going to be clearly very important because this is one of the requirements of the law. Okay, so here's an example. This is, again, taken from the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. And this was an example where they had a score. So what I'm showing here on the screen for those who are listening is a table where there's columns for gender, race, and ethnicity. Number of samples, that was one that I put that wasn't in the original table. The average score, and then the impact ratio. Now, the reason I put the number of samples I talked about last week, we think that getting some sense of uncertainty for these numbers is going to be really critical, because that's strictly part of how you define disparate impact if you're talking about the context of federal regulation. And so you should have that information here as well. And whether you put it in the table or not, I think it's something that you should be aware of, because it gives context to the numbers, and the final column is the impact ratio itself. And so vendors can do this, it seems, unless the department says otherwise. They've implied it through their new rules. But as a vendor, you have to be wary of what you're doing. So the next slide here says risky caveats for vendors. Okay, so things to keep in mind. Limits on the available data. So you may not have demographic data. So if you are using data that is not strictly self-reported demographics, then you should really clearly explain the limitations of the data that you're using. What assumptions did you make? Did you have proxy variables that you were using? What might be the uncertainties on those proxy variables? And communicating it both to your auditor, which might be us, and the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, who might be looking at this, and also candidates, and your clients. So if your clients are relying on these bias audits, they have to be aware of what the potential limitations are, because that's a risk that they're taking on as well. And so that you have to inform them. Number 2, employer side control. So one thing that's risky for vendors here is that many of your tools are going to have knobs that can be turned on the employer side. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the number of knobs that they have to turn, those can directly affect disparate impact. In fact, if it's a tool that they just use to inform their decisions, almost all the disparate impact, if any, could come from the employer side. And so you may test your tool, and it may be, on the face of things, let's say, relatively unbiased based on the data that you've collected. Some of those knobs that get turned on the employer side could lead to disparate impact. Some of the human decisions that get made on the employer side could lead to disparate impact for the employers. So I think it's important to articulate the extent that employers can control your system. This is sort of for your risk and just for informing your clients. And articulating the fact that these things are out of your control and they could lead to disparate impact. So that flags for the employers that maybe they need to be doing also their own testing if there are many of these controls in place. And then 3, how applicable is your testing to all of the employers that are using your tool? This is a really important, relevant thing. Every employer is going to have a different use case, or maybe not. Maybe your tool is very straightforward and everybody's going to use it in exactly the same way with exactly the same settings. If that's not the case, then you need to explain likely limits to the applicability of that testing. So we tested it, let's say, in this range of parameters. If you use this tool outside these range of parameters, then user beware. Let's put it that way. That kind of thing has to be articulated. What were the parameters that you used, and so that people know whether the testing that you did may or may not apply to them. Another final thing on section 3 which is not strictly under employer applicability, but the applicability of your testing is what's the cadence at which this is updated. I think that it's important if your tool is being constantly updated and you do testing, but the testing is over the past month, but the tool may change next month, that has to be disclosed. I think that has to be disclosed at the very least to your clients and the employers, but it has to be also documented, I think, for the regulators. And so this is something that you should keep in mind. How often are you adjusting this? Be transparent about that. And if it's being tested, let's say, or changed every month, is it being tested every month? And if it is, then that's something that you should have done, and you should articulate in the bias audit and potentially update the public summary based on that. Okay, so we're at 10:30 now. So, well, 10:30 Central Time, 11:30 Eastern Time. So let me just talk a little bit really briefly about what BABL does and how we approach this sort of testing. And in particular, what we're doing is, we've done this testing a lot ourselves in terms of hands-on, looking at algorithms, collecting data, testing for bias, doing ethical risk and impact assessments to inform how we test it. But for this law, we're doing something slightly different, which is we have criteria. Based on our experience, we've come up with criteria for what this testing should look like. And so we're allowing people to do their own testing, keep the documentation, give it to us, and we do the evaluation and the verification based on our criteria and based on the claims verification process. I'm going to skip this section, and I'm going to go right to some of the criteria. So some of the things to keep in mind, and I think we may not be the only ones that are doing this. The kind of things that we're going to want are detailed descriptions of, probably most importantly, the testing data set and justification for why that testing data is relevant, why it applies to disparate impact and bias in general, why it applies to that tool, and if you're a vendor, talking about why it might apply to some large subsection of your clients, especially if they're going to be relying on this. And so, we can, if anybody wants a copy of this, we can give you a copy. These are going to be public come January 1st, all of this criteria. So we're happy to talk more about it. But I think I'm going to leave it there. And so let me stop sharing. And let me find the Q&A here. And put on my glasses, per usual. Okay, so we have got one question that says, how can vendors who develop new tools conduct the bias audit without already having employer data? So this is a critical question, which I think was part of our comments to the department. And the answer is that's very difficult. You're going to have to probably go the vendor workflow that I showed, which is the more complicated vendor workflow. You're going to have to get data that is not employee data. And so presumably if this is a statistical model, some machine learning or AI model, and you're training it on data, and then you're testing it and validating it on other data, you need to figure out how to get demographic information into that data. And hopefully you can, that's not hard. Hopefully you can find that. I know from practice that is hard. And so the importance here is to justify what assumptions you're making. So you have to justify the assumptions you're making when you're labeling that data according to demographics. So you might be using it might be some historical data where you have names, and so you might be using the names themselves and potentially zip codes or something to encode the demographic information. Other proxies, you just have to state that kind of thing clearly. And so from the perspective of our audit, we allow that. You make those decisions. You just have to justify why it's applicable. And so justify the demographic labels and then justify why it does apply to live employer data, let's say, or candidate data that's coming through your system. Justify that those populations are similar, and that your testing does apply. You won't know that until you actually get it live. And so you have to just be clear about those assumptions and make sure you check those assumptions when you do start getting data. So that was a good question. Another question is, how much data should employers give vendors to facilitate the bias audits? Okay, well, in my opinion, there's a trade-off here. The trade-off is giving data, candidate data, let's say, or an employee data, is risky from a sort of data minimization, from a privacy standpoint. There is a lot of risk associated with sharing that data. And so there has to be a sort of frank conversation as to how much data do you need in order to test. So employers are the ones on the hook for this. And so one optimal, I don't want to call it optimal, one scenario that I could envision is that vendors do testing as best they can, using as much data as they have available through the same means they use to train this data, to train the algorithms. And that is supplied to the employer. Let's say maybe it's been audited by a company like ours, so that's been verified, that testing has been verified, that in fact it's something that's reliable. And then the employer can use that as evidence in addition to some of their own calculations from their own data, which may have small numbers, and so that's problematic. But that in combination with other testing, I think you should have an accumulation of evidence is also something that I think is totally a reasonable thing to do. Now, if you can securely transfer data from the employer to a vendor in a way that is compliant with other privacy laws, like GDPR is a big one. I know this is New York and this is not Europe, but GDPR is a really good standard to look to. If you could do this in a way that is secure and safe and anonymize the data in an appropriate way with all of the safeguards, then I think it's best to get that real live candidate data. That's the ultimate. And especially if you have enough numbers, it's better to do that than to simply rely on some proxy information or some assumptions. The fewer assumptions you can rely on, the better. So anyway, I don't know if that fully answered the question. So I think we're going to end here. I think we're going to talk again next week. I think there's a lot to bias auditing that there's a ton to bias auditing that I did not mention. I didn't mention any of the technical details of how you might do it, none of the statistics that go into this, but I think we do want to go there. We do want to talk about those technical issues. But today I really wanted to highlight the difference between what testing might look like on the employer side and what it might look like on the vendor side, why those are sort of fundamentally different, the risks associated with that, and how employers and vendors need to start thinking about compromises and ways in which they can sort of do the best job that they can to be compliant with this law. All right. Hope everybody had a good time, and I will see you next week.